Hey, what's up? This is Chosen and going to be joined by Veiled Shot. Today, we're going to be talking about if you should main Rogue, what the advantages and disadvantages of maining Rogue will be, some of the skills and builds to look out for, talking with one of the Rogue experts here, a Diablo 4 content creator in Veiled Shot. Well, let's get into it. Hey, what's up, Veiled Shot? How we doing today?
Doing pretty good. Lots of Diablo going around. I am just staring at spreadsheets, staring at builds, and yeah, that's the life right now.
Yeah, exactly. And Veiled's covering Diablo 4 extremely extensively. I will link to his content down below. He's been in the Diablo community for a while, covering Diablo Immortal with us, covering it Diablo 4. Going to be cranking out probably about 100 videos in the next month.
Yeah, maybe more. We'll see.
Love it, love it. Let's talk about the rogue, and I have like Darth on to talk about Druid, and gonna have you to talk about rogue, and we're gonna bring an expert on the channel about each class. So just kind of an overarching view. How do you feel about the rogue's place in the game, and what would be some of like the advantages and disadvantages for someone picking rogue at the launch of the game?
So I'll say this: I'm not going to consider like post level 50 even because I think that in general that's going to change drastically once we actually get our hands on the Paragon board and everything that comes associated with that. So who knows what the classes will be like when we get to that point. I still think Rogue will be a strong contender, but there's no doubt in my mind, especially with the recent nerfs to like Necro Summons and Sorcerer damage, that Rogue is by far the fastest leveling class. So if you're someone that wants to immediately get to that Paragon system and maybe blast through the campaign, the Rogue is super mobile with tons of mobility skills, super high damage. And what's interesting is if you play some of my favorite skills like Twisting Blades, it's going to be able to just hit and move and kill everything while just running through everything. So definitely the strongest leveling class, I'd say, is the Rogue's biggest strength.
Well, I asked for advantages and disadvantages here, Veiled. So what would be the disadvantage of playing? Can you think of one?
I, you know what? I think the biggest one to me is a lot of people say they have the strongest defensive ability, and I would agree with that, which is the Dark Shroud. So you have like 5 stacks of damage reduction. The only problem with it is that it only works if you're only getting hit like once or twice. After that, you have very limited defensive capability. So oftentimes when you're in a group of monsters, then you're going to end up in a situation where you could easily just get locked down and one shot, assuming you're not getting hit by only one attack every like 10 seconds. So they are pretty squishy, assuming you're not managing properly, and that can get a little tricky sometimes.
Okay, and would it be fair to say that Rogue may have a little bit of a higher like input requirement, maybe like a higher skill ceiling, maybe be like running around with Necro Summoners might be a little bit of a lazier way to level, or like Hydras from the Sork and stuff like that?
Yeah, I'll say that, especially if you're running Twisting Blades. If you run like a little bit of a ranged build, it can be a little bit less intensive. But with like the melee skills in particular, you're using things like dash, shadow step, where you're dashing across screen or you're hopping behind enemies. And the goal is to like actually move through enemies. You get extra effectiveness. You have to be relatively quick on the class. It's a little bit different from like playing, I don't know, like an upheaval barb where you're just running in and you can cone AoE, or like chain lightning, like you just click, even though that one has a skill shot. Like there's just a lot of other skills in the game that don't require as quick input. And I think that is one thing to consider with the rogue, is that you're probably going to have to be somewhat proficient with, using your skills.
Okay, so maybe a little bit higher of a threshold in terms of how much the player has to pay attention, but it is rewarded with being the strongest leveling class. Okay, in your opinion, that's probably gonna be a hot take that people disagree with or something. I'm sure at some point. But is the ranged rogue viable? I know you've kind of been playing the Twisting Blades, and I'm hearing about that all over the Diablo 4 community. What if somebody's like, you know what, I like to play the archer, I want to use bows. Is that viable? Or if it's not viable, how much worse is it than like the Twisting Blade style?
So I'll say this: I've played every single skill on the Rogue, and the range builds do have an exceptionally great options. For one, the rapid fire is not great at AoE, but when it comes to killing bosses, there is no other skill on the Rogue that's better than the rapid fire. So running rapid fire, you can get essentially infinite energy, still run combo points if you want, or you could just absolutely annihilate bosses, especially with the poison imbuement. You can do some massive DPS. And of course, you are ranged, which makes it a little bit easier typically to kind of avoid a lot of the more boss damaging abilities, which is a struggle with sometimes the flurry or twisting blade. So rapid fire is really good for single target. Barrage, in my opinion, is probably the weakest skill overall on the rogue. I'm not a huge fan of it when I was initially, but penetrating shots actually really good as well, especially with dungeons, because you oftentimes have corridors, right? Like it's not a super open space typically. So penetrating shot, you can kind of run past or shadow step past people and then shoot a shot straight through and then just do basically a whole hall or whole corridor clear with one ability. So yeah, there are some options, especially with penetrating shot and rapid fire, but they aren't quite as fast, but they do have their uses in especially rapid fire for bosses.
Okay, gotcha. And how, like, so I was actually expecting you to say that it wasn't viable at all in terms of leveling compared to like the melee twisting blades kind of stuff. You know, how much, you know, like how much slower is it? And like if you were gonna play, you know, level 1 to level 50, how would it be? 10% slower, 20% slower? What are we talking here? Like if Veiled Shot played ranged instead of Veiled Shot playing twisting blades.
If I went with the build that I wanted to go with, I would probably say, I mean, based on what the developers have said and my experience, the campaign is going to be shorter than what they said because we got through the Act 1 in like an hour and a half, and they're expecting 35, 40 hours. So I don't expect that to take that long. But if I were to guess, let's say level 50 takes like 40 hours or so. And that's like an average class. Twisting Blades is going to be like maybe 20 hours, so significantly quicker. And then your ranged builds maybe around like the 25-hour mark. It is going to be a decent chunk slower, and that's just because Twisting Blades reduces your cooldowns. And because it reduces your cooldowns, you can literally just leap through things quicker, and that allows you to get through the dungeons quicker in a strict like movement ability sense, not even necessarily the damage potential, but also because the rogue range doesn't necessarily have the ability to kind of hit and move, it has to stay in place and shoot and then stay in place and shoot. That's where the twisting blades kind of makes up the time. And so range isn't going to be too much worse, but it will maybe add like an additional 10-20% to your time.
Okay, gotcha. Then I guess walk me through just like the really quick, like 30-second rundown here of this leveling rogue that you, in your opinion, this TB leveling rogue is like what you are gonna do, right? Is that the best choice? Okay, cool. Then just give me like the quick rundown of like the main talking points of maybe why it's strong and what to, and like the play style involved and all that.
So the first thing I like to consider when we're talking about leveling, there's two things that I love, right? Mobility, because we just want to clear things quick. And then two is single target damage. I don't really care about survivability in the early levels. It's really not too tricky until we start pushing nightmare dungeons. Same thing with Diablo 3. But what's critical with this build is twisting blades and the mobility skills, and then later on we pick up poison imbuement. Now a lot of people don't really know this, but when you hit twisting blades, you're going to stab someone and it rips the blades back to you when you're walking. But what's cool about it is when you pick up a specific aspect, which is pretty early on into the game, around Act 2 in Skosglen, it's called Blade Dancers, and it's going to make the twisting blades spin around you. So now twisting blades, when they return, they're going to AoE a little bit. It's not a ton of damage, but the key is it applies poison imbuement on an AoE. So that's the kicker, is poison imbuement got a buff from the recent Server Slam beta, and with that buff that I experienced, it was so much stronger. And on top of that, we can now create essentially what's supposed to be a single target ability into a massive AoE ability with the Blade Dancers aspect. And that combined with a lot of our damage increasing passives, we just do massive DPS overall on a dot build while also doing super high, just straight up burst damage with Twisting Blades.
Okay, great. That all makes sense. It looks like you chose the close quarters as like your final. Okay, and I'll link to this down below if anybody's looking for the Veiled Shot Pro tip version here, and I also link to his channel down below to follow for specifics as well. And then one of the last things I want to ask you, I did a recent tier list. I know you've done all sorts of tier lists as well, probably. So just real quick for the people who haven't seen, give me the rundown 1 through 5, how you would rank the classes right now for leveling.
Ooh, yeah, Rogue to me is like a 0, and then you have like no one in the 1 slot because Rogue is just far superior, and then to me it's Sorcerer. So like Rogue is, I think, a big step up for any class compared to any class in the leveling process. So that's 1 to 50. Then it's Sorcerer. Then to me it's going to be Necromancer. Then Barbarian. Then Druid.
Okay, and I think that's pretty much the same. Yeah, that seems to be the consensus, at least a little bit. I said the same thing in my video. I have the same opinion as you, but I know there's some hot takes out there. I know I get comments sometimes saying, like, oh, we're crazy. Druid and Barb are going to be god tier in the end game. The Blizzard devs said that Druid's going to be the strongest class. I see like these website articles saying that. Is there any sort of reply that you would want to say about that? Like, do you feel strong that Rogue is going to either have to get nerfed or there's going to have to be buffs to other classes, even like in the end game? How do you feel in terms of being solidified in that position?
I'd say that I think the 2 major contenders to kind of shoot up in the late game is Druid and Barb. I'd have to agree with that. However, I think there's a couple of considerations to make. Like Druid has a lot of synergy with their abilities. So, when we actually get to theory crafting and we actually experience the game, that's when we could start to see some really, really powerful builds crop up. There's going to be some geniuses out there. And then, of course, with Barb, a lot of people's sites, and myself included, the fact that you can basically go ahead and get 2 additional legendary aspects, and they're both two-handed, right? Because like a sorcerer, if you're going to use a main hand and offhand, well, that's all the aspects for weapons that you have. But the Barb gets a mace two-handed and a sword two-handed, or whatever weapon you want to use, which means that you have so many more options and strength of aspects. So when you start to get and farm your aspects in the late game, when you're not, changing your gear every 2 seconds, you're going to be a lot stronger. However, and I think a lot of people forget about this, Rogue has the second most aspects available to them because they have a 2-headed bow and then they have 2 daggers or 2 swords or whatever. So they're kind of in that place where they're already strong in terms of just how much they have available to them. But also, even though the aspects aren't quite as strong, they have a lot of potential later on too to get a lot of options for their build. So I think that they're going to be pretty solid. I definitely think they're still going to be within at least top 3 in the end game, but we'll see where Druid and Barb end up. Especially, I do think that Sorcerer or Necro, I'm not quite sure. I haven't looked into their end game potential yet, but we'll have to see.
Okay, great. And then lastly, what do you think the gap is? Like you feel that Rogue is going to be the fastest in terms of leveling. So then, and you think like Barb and Druid are going to be the slowest. What is that gap? Like you said, you think it's going to be 20, 25 hours for you to get max level on Rogue. If Veiled Shot played a Barb or a Druid, what do you think that you, like the same player, just on a different class, what do you think it would shift to you, like finishing that? Like how much slower would it be?
That's an interesting question. So with Druid, you really don't have a ton of movement options. As far as I know, you have only like some minor movement speed increasing. And so, oh man, that's got to be really slow. Like the damage is low. There's not many mobility options. I would say maybe even twice as much time you could see. Maybe that may be a little harsh. Maybe like a 50% increase in time. So you're thinking like 30, 35 hours or so. For the Barb, you at least have Leap, which can jump over terrain. You do have some decent damaging skills. The main problem with Barb is that they have to be in melee range, and they don't have any way to like quickly get into melee range and generate a bunch of resource. So for them, maybe like 25 to 30 hours mark is what I'd guess. So definitely longer, but not a crazy amount of extra time.
Okay, great, awesome. I appreciate you chatting with me about Rogue and then some random other stuff compared to Rogue. So is there anything that you wanted to get in there before I wrap up with you that I should have asked or that you wanted to make sure I mentioned about the Rogue in leveling on release?
Uh, Pretty much that. People underestimated Twisting Blades. I think when people saw the nerfs, they're like, it's a dead build, but And they didn't nerf the damage, guys. It's still really good. So just don't knock on the rogue until you've actually experienced the power. It's insane.
All right, love it. And I will link to Veilshot's channel down below, and he is cranking out amazing content for Diablo 4 on a daily basis. Definitely head on over there and check him out. So yeah, thanks for your time, Veiled. It's always fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.